I am Victor Coronado. I had the honor and privilege of sitting down with the person the New York Times calls arguably the most important intellectual alive. He is none other than Professor Noam Chomsky, MIT Professor of Linguistics. Here's my conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. First of all, Professor Chomsky, thank you for accepting the interview request with Latino Rebel. I want to start off with a quote from your book, Interventions. It's titled, Latin America Declares Its Independence. You wrote this on September 6, 2006. 5 centuries after the European conquest, South America is reasserting its independence. From Venezuela to Argentina, much of the region is rising to overthrow the legacy of external domination of the past centuries and the cruel and destructive social forms that they have helped to establish. The mechanisms of imperial control, violence, and economic warfare, hardly a distant memory in Latin America, are losing their effectiveness, a sign of the shift towards independence. Washington is now compelled to tolerate governments that in the past would have drawn intervention or reprisal. Professor Chomsky, can you talk about the last 10 years or so, the movements in Latin America? There's a wonderful revolution happening in Latin America. No one here in the United States seems to know anything about it or even care.
The fact that there's much less attention to Latin America is actually one of the side effects of the progress that's been made. Up until very recently, it's been taken for granted that we must control Latin America. That's our backyard. And if anything got out of control, the U.S. immediately moved in and crushed it. I mean, to this day, we're carrying out an embargo against Cuba in international isolation. Nobody supports it. And the reasons, you go back to the internal record or go Johnson-Kennedy administration, it's because of what they called the Castro's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. That means to the Monroe Doctrine, which established the principle that we're going to control Latin America. The U.S. was not powerful enough to do it then, but over the century it was able to do it. You get to say the Nixon administration, when they were planning the overthrow of the parliamentary government in Chile and installing the dictatorship, Pinochet dictatorship, the internal records say, if we can't control Latin America, how can we control the world? You know, that's been the principle, and it went right on until recently. And that's just the last stages of control of Latin America. I mean, for 500 years since the Spanish and Portuguese explorers came, Latin America was disintegrated. So countries were separated from one another. Very little integration, and of course, integration is a requirement, prerequisite for independence. And furthermore, internally, the typical Latin American country had a very small, Europeanized, often white elite, which concentrated enormous wealth in the midst of a huge mass of poverty, some of the worst inequality in the world. And these are rich areas, lots of resources should have developed and so on. Well, that remained pretty much the case up until roughly 10 years ago. And then there has been in the last roughly decade a significant move towards integration, independence, addressing some of the horrifying internal problems. There's an indigenous uprising, which is quite significant. In the poorest country of South America, they took political power, elected someone from their own ranks, Evo Morales. These are all changes of historical significance. Now the U.S. is compelled to deal with the kinds of governments that it used to just overthrow. Obama's latest trip was a perfect example of that. Say Brazil, the most important country of Latin America, the Lula government, the Rousseff government today its policies are not very different from those of the Goulart government in the early 60s. Well, at that point, the Kennedy administration simply organized a military coup throughout the government, installed a vicious dictatorship, a national security state, torture, murder, and so on. And then that set off a plague that spread through the whole hemisphere. Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, 1980s, Reagan's wars in Central America. It was just routine. Everything was crushed. In fact, from the early 60s to 1989, the U.S. was actually carrying out a major war against the Catholic Church. Plenty of religious martyrs. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, the 6 Jesuit intellectuals were murdered in 1989, on and on. And the reason was, as a reflection of Vatican II, 1962, Latin American bishops were attempting to restore the Church of the Gospels. That was the message of Vatican II. It's after 16 centuries. It was a big change. And that meant what was called a preferential option for the poor, bringing the Gospel's message of radical pacifism to poor peasants, people who had been suffering under the yoke of imperialism and violence and so on. And the U.S. wasn't having any of that, so it launched a war. And it was a brutal war, plenty of killing and destruction. Well, in the 1980s, that was made even worse by the structural adjustment programs. It's a separate story in itself. It was an economic disaster. And finally, in the last 10 years, they're pulling out of it. And that's after 500 years, not small. So I think that's extremely significant. And the fact that there's very little coverage in the United States is a reflection of the loss of control. The U.S. no longer has a single military base in South America. I mean, it's still engaged. So in the last 10 years, there have actually been 3 military coups. The first one was in Venezuela in 2002. The U.S. openly, publicly supported the coup, overthrew the government, disbanded the parliament, and so on. So that was fine, except that there was a popular uprising, and it overthrew the coup, and the U.S. had to back off and turn to subversion. That was the first. The second was in Haiti, the weakest country in the hemisphere, and there France and the United States, 2 traditional torturers of Haiti for hundreds of years, invaded, kidnapped the president, sent him off to Central Africa, have prevented his political party from running in elections because every election they run in, they easily win, so that can't be allowed. He, incidentally, a populist priest, liberation theologist. The U.S. has tried very hard to keep him out of the hemisphere. Haven't quite managed, but they came pretty close. That's the second. The third coup was in Honduras, 2009. That's under Obama. First, the U.S. sort of pretended to oppose the coup. If they wouldn't call it a coup, although it obviously was. They sort of dithered about it. And finally, the Obama administration broke with almost all of Latin America and even most of Europe and supported the military coup and the election that was taking place under the coup leadership. There's now plenty of violence and terror and murder of opposition leaders and so on. It doesn't even get reported. And I should mention, I don't think it's accidental. Honduras is one of the last U.S. military bases. It's the big military base, the Palmarola base, I think. Maybe the last big one on the continent, in fact. There's some offshore in the Dutch islands. Well, so it hasn't disappeared, but it's nothing like what it was in the past.
Professor Chomsky, Ecuador closed their military bases there. The United States and Colombia had agreed shortly thereafter for Colombia to allow the U.S. to use their military bases there, and the U.S. has also reactivated the 4th Fleet in the Caribbean. The significance of this in Latin America and the threat that U.S. military intervention poses to Latin America.
The Latin American leaders reacted very negatively to the plan to allow the U.S. access to half a dozen Colombian military bases. In fact, there was a meeting right away of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. Its existence is something important. That's a sign of the integration of the countries. And it was strongly condemned. Practically no support for it. I think Garcia in Peru was the only one who supported it. The Constitutional Court in Colombia has so far blocked it. So the bases are not yet and may never be active. That's even in Colombia, the most loyal ally. But yeah, Brazil and others do regard it as a threat, and they had good reason to. Documents began to leak, and it turned out there were far-reaching plans to use one of the Colombian bases as a means of surveillance of the entire continent, maybe linking up through further bases to the Africa Command, part of the global surveillance and control system. So sure, that's a threat. I mean, the pretext is drugs, but if you look at the training of Latin American officers has gone way up. That's alongside the reactivation of the Fourth Fleet, another effort to try to reinstitute control. And if you look at the training has been shifted from the State Department to the Pentagon. It's not insignificant. When training is under the State Department, it's theoretically under congressional control. So it's possible, it doesn't happen much, but Congress could institute conditions like human rights training and so on. When it's under the Pentagon, it's nothing. Do it, whatever you like. Train in CIA torture techniques, whatever you want to do. And the targets are supposed to be radical populism. Now, radical populism means something in Latin America. That means priests organizing peasants, union leaders, anyone you want to kill and torture. And that's not insignificant. But so far they can't really carry it off. They're trying. But I think it's going to be hard to beat back these rising forces in South America, particularly a little bit in Central America, less. That was beaten down pretty harshly, not entirely.